On a bitter February morning in 2005, in the isolated farming community of Garrison, North Dakota, a young woman named Michelle Hartley stepped out of her modest ranch house to start her truck, the engine fighting against the cold that had settled over the plains like a blanket of ice. She was 27 years old, a substitute teacher at the local elementary school, a daughter, a sister, a friend to many in this town of fewer than 1,500 souls. By noon that same day, Michelle Hartley had vanished without a trace, leaving behind her purse, her keys still in the ignition of that running truck, and a community that would spend the next 18 years asking the same impossible question. Where did Michelle go? Garrison sits in McLean County, approximately 70 miles north of Bismarck, cradled between the vast expanse of Lake Sakakawea to the west and endless stretches of farmland to the east. In February, the landscape transforms into something almost lunar, white and windswept, with temperatures that regularly drop below zero. The kind of cold that makes your breath crystallize in the air before you can exhale fully. The kind of cold where vehicles refuse to start, where exposed skin begins to freeze within minutes, where the wind carries voices away before they can be heard. The Hartley family had lived in Garrison for 3 generations. Michelle's grandfather had purchased 200 acres of farmland in 1952, building the foundation of what would become a modest but stable life for his descendants. Michelle's father, Robert Hartley, worked at the local grain elevator. Her mother, Susan, managed the front desk at the Garrison Medical Clinic. They lived on Elm Street, a quiet residential road lined with single-story houses and towering cottonwood trees that in winter stood like skeletal sentinels against the pale sky. Michelle had graduated from Garrison High School in 1996, attended Minot State University for 2 years before returning home to help care for her grandmother during a long illness. She never left again. By 2005, she had settled into a routine that suited her temperament. She worked as a substitute teacher, filling in whenever Mrs. Anderson or Mr. Kowalski needed coverage. She volunteered at the public library on Thursday evenings. She attended Sunday services at First Lutheran Church with her parents. She dated occasionally but never seriously. Those who knew Michelle described her as reliable, thoughtful, perhaps a bit quiet, but warm once you got past her initial reserve. February 10, 2005, began like most winter mornings in Garrison. The sun rose late, casting long shadows across the snow-covered streets. The temperature hovered at 8 degrees below zero, with a wind chill that made it feel closer to 30 below. Michelle woke at 6:15, showered, dressed in jeans and a thick wool sweater, and joined her parents for breakfast in the small kitchen where a radio played soft country music and the smell of coffee filled the air. Susan Hartley would later recall that Michelle seemed perfectly normal that morning. She ate toast with strawberry jam. She complained mildly about the cold. She mentioned that she had been called to substitute at the elementary school that day, covering for Mrs. Anderson who had the flu. Nothing in her demeanor suggested anything unusual. Nothing in her words hinted at what was about to unfold. At 7:32, Michelle pulled on her heavy winter coat, a burgundy parka her parents had given her for Christmas. She wrapped a scarf around her neck, pulled on insulated gloves, grabbed her canvas tote bag that contained her lesson plans and supplies. She kissed her mother on the cheek. She called goodbye to her father who was reading the newspaper in the living room. She stepped out the front door into air so cold it burned the lungs. The truck, a 1998 Chevrolet S10 in faded blue, was parked in the driveway approximately 20 feet from the house. Michelle's father watched through the living room window as she walked to the vehicle, her breath visible in white puffs. He saw her open the driver's side door. He saw her lean in to start the engine, a necessary ritual in North Dakota winters, letting the vehicle warm up before attempting to drive. He heard the engine turn over, catch, rumble to life. He watched Michelle step back from the truck, leaving the door slightly ajar, presumably to let heat build in the cab. Robert Hartley returned his attention to the newspaper. He estimated Michelle stood by the truck for perhaps 30 seconds, maybe a minute at most. Long enough for him to read 2 paragraphs about proposed changes to farm subsidies. When he glanced up again, intending to wave as Michelle drove away, the driveway was empty except for the truck, still running, driver's door hanging open, exhaust streaming white into the frigid air. Michelle was gone. Robert stood from his chair, walked to the window, pressed his face against the cold glass. He scanned the yard, the street, the neighbors' properties. Nothing moved except the bare branches of the cottonwoods swaying in the wind. He called for Susan. Together they stood at the window, staring at that idling truck with its open door, and felt the first cold fingers of dread begin to close around their hearts. Robert pulled on boots and a jacket and hurried outside. The snow in the driveway showed Michelle's footprints leading from the house to the truck, clear and distinct in the fresh powder that had fallen overnight. But there were no footprints leading away. He circled the vehicle. Michelle's purse sat on the passenger seat. Her keys dangled from the ignition. Her cell phone rested in the cup holder. Her tote bag lay on the floor. Everything she had carried outside remained inside the truck. Everything except Michelle herself. Susan called the Garrison Police Department at 7:41. Chief Dennis Morrison, a man who had served the community for 23 years and knew every family by name, arrived at the Hartley residence within 6 minutes. He examined the scene with growing confusion. The snow told a simple story that made no sense. Footprints from house to truck. No footprints away. No signs of struggle. No disturbance in the snow. No indication that another vehicle had been present. Michelle had simply vanished, as if she had been plucked from the earth itself. By 8:15, Morrison had called in the McLean County Sheriff's Department. By 9 o'clock, officers were canvassing the neighborhood, knocking on doors, asking if anyone had seen anything unusual that morning. By 10:30, search teams were forming. Volunteers from the community, farmers with knowledge of the surrounding land, off-duty officers from neighboring counties. They spread out in widening circles, searching fields, checking abandoned buildings, scanning the frozen surface of Lake Sakakawea where the ice stretched thick and solid. The temperature continued to drop throughout the day. The wind picked up, howling across the plains, making communication difficult, making the search dangerous. Those who have ever experienced a North Dakota winter understand the terror of exposure, the knowledge that a person unprepared without shelter cannot survive more than a few hours in such conditions. If Michelle was out there somewhere, lost or injured, time was already running out. The search continued through the afternoon and into the evening, flashlight beams cutting through the darkness, voices calling Michelle's name into the void. They found nothing. No tracks, no clothing, no blood, no signs of a struggle anywhere in the vicinity. It was as if Michelle Hartley had been erased from existence in the span of seconds, leaving behind only a running truck and questions that had no answers. Part 2. The investigation. The full-scale investigation began on February 11th, with temperatures still hovering in the single digits and fresh snow complicating the already scarce evidence. The North Dakota Bureau of Criminal Investigation sent 2 special agents, Martin Kohler and Sarah Dennison, both experienced in missing persons cases. They established a command center in the Garrison Community Center, a single-story building on Main Street that normally hosted bingo nights and youth basketball games. Search teams expanded their efforts, dividing McLean County into grids. Volunteers numbered in the hundreds. Farmers brought tractors and all-terrain vehicles. Divers prepared to search beneath the ice of Lake Sakakawea despite the extreme danger. The National Weather Service had issued warnings about the cold, but nothing could deter the community from searching for one of their own. Those who knew Michelle said she would have done the same for any of them, that she had that kind of heart, that she deserved every effort they could muster. The media descended on Garrison by the second day. News vans from Bismarck, Minot, and even Fargo parked along Main Street. Reporters interviewed anyone willing to speak. Michelle's photograph appeared on television screens across the state, a smiling image from her college years, her dark hair pulled back, her expression open and genuine. The story captured public attention because of its mysterious circumstances. A woman vanishing in broad daylight from her own driveway. No witnesses. No evidence. No explanation that made any sense. Investigators interviewed the Hartley family extensively. Robert Hartley recounted the morning in precise detail, his voice steady but his hands trembling as he described watching Michelle walk to her truck. Susan Hartley provided Michelle's medical history, her dental records, a list of friends and acquaintances, any detail that might prove useful. Both parents submitted to polygraph examinations voluntarily, both passed without issue. Their grief appeared genuine, their confusion absolute. Clear's throat. But as the investigation progressed, certain inconsistencies began to emerge. Small things at first, details that did not quite align. Michelle's best friend, Jennifer Carlson, reported that Michelle had seemed distracted in recent weeks. Not upset exactly, but preoccupied. Jennifer mentioned that Michelle had received several phone calls that she would not discuss, calls that seemed to make her uncomfortable. When asked if Michelle had mentioned any problems, any concerns, Jennifer hesitated before saying Michelle had alluded to feeling watched, though she had dismissed it as paranoia brought on by too many true crime documentaries. The elementary school principal, Harold Eckhart, confirmed that Michelle had been scheduled to substitute teach that morning, but he also mentioned something curious. When he had called Michelle 3 days earlier to arrange the substitution, he thought he heard a male voice in the background. Michelle had quickly ended the call, saying she would confirm via email. Eckhart thought little of it at the time, but in retrospect, it seemed worth mentioning. Investigators examined Michelle's phone records. The calls Jennifer mentioned were there, a series of brief contacts from a prepaid cell phone that investigators could not trace to any registered owner. The calls had begun in late January, occurring every few days, usually in the evening. Each call lasted less than 2 minutes. Michelle had never called the number back. She had never mentioned these calls to her parents. Deputies whispered quietly among themselves about another detail that troubled them. Michelle's truck had been running for approximately 10 minutes when Robert Hartley first noticed her absence. In that time, the vehicle should have warmed considerably, yet when Chief Morrison examined it, the interior was still quite cold, as if the door had been open for most of that time, as if someone had been standing there, keeping the door ajar, perhaps waiting for something or someone. The investigation turned to Michelle's personal life with increased scrutiny. She had dated a man named Eric Strand 2 years prior, a relationship that had ended amicably according to both parties. Eric, who worked as a mechanic in Minot, provided an alibi for the morning of February 10th. He had been at work, signed in at 7 o'clock, witnessed by multiple coworkers throughout the morning. Investigators cleared him quickly. But then another name surfaced, David Keller, a man who had moved to Garrison approximately 8 months earlier, taking a job as a farmhand on the Olson property, working land that bordered the southern edge of town. David was 34 years old, originally from somewhere in Minnesota according to the sketchy employment records he had provided. He lived alone in a small trailer on the Olson farm. He kept to himself mostly, though he occasionally came into town for supplies. Several people mentioned having seen David Keller at the library on Thursday evenings. The same Thursday evenings Michelle volunteered there. The librarian, Margaret Simmons, confirmed that David had started coming to the library regularly around September, always staying for an hour or two, always checking out books about farming techniques and local history. Margaret had noticed him speaking with Michelle on several occasions, though their conversations appeared casual, brief exchanges about book recommendations or library policies. When investigators visited David Keller on February 13th, they found him in the trailer, listening to the radio, cleaning a hunting rifle. He appeared surprised by their visit but not particularly concerned. He confirmed that he knew who Michelle Hartley was, that he had spoken to her at the library a few times, that he was aware she had gone missing. He expressed appropriate concern. He said he hoped she would be found safe. Asked about his whereabouts on the morning of February 10th, David said he had been working on the Olson property, repairing fence posts in the southern pasture. He had started early, around 6:30, and worked until noon. When asked if anyone could confirm this, he said no. He had worked alone. The Olsons, an elderly couple, rarely ventured out to the far pastures in winter. He had no alibi beyond his word. Investigators asked if they could search his trailer. David hesitated, then agreed. The search revealed little of interest: basic furnishings, hunting equipment, nothing that connected him to Michelle beyond the public interactions at the library. But there was something about David Keller that troubled the investigators. Something in the way he answered questions with practiced ease. Something in the way his eyes remained flat and emotionless even as he expressed concern for Michelle's welfare. Those who have interviewed countless suspects develop instincts about when someone is hiding something, even if the evidence does not yet support that instinct. Agent Kohler noted in his report that David Keller's truck, a white Ford F-150, had been recently cleaned inside and out despite the muddy conditions of farm work in early spring thaw. He noted that David's boots, sitting by the trailer door, showed minimal wear despite 8 months of farm labor. He noted that David claimed to have no family, no close friends, no roots anywhere that could be verified. He noted all of this, but without physical evidence, without witnesses, without anything concrete. There was nothing to justify an arrest or even continued surveillance. The days stretched into weeks. The search efforts gradually diminished as hope faded. Divers found nothing beneath the lake ice. Cadaver dogs picked up no scent. Aerial searches revealed no bodies in the surrounding farmland. It was as if Michelle Hartley had stepped into another dimension, leaving reality behind. The FBI became involved in early March, lending resources and expertise to the investigation. They created a profile of potential suspects. They examined similar cases across the region. They found nothing that advanced the case. By April, when the snow finally began to melt and the ground thawed enough to search areas that had been inaccessible during winter, investigators conducted another sweep of the region. They found nothing. The case began to go cold. Media attention dwindled. Volunteers returned to their normal lives. The command center at the community center closed. Robert and Susan Hartley held a memorial service in May, though they refused to declare Michelle legally deceased. They could not bring themselves to accept finality. They posted flyers with Michelle's photograph throughout the region. They maintained a website with information about the case. They waited for answers that never came. Investigators kept the file open, kept David Keller's name in their notes as a person of interest, but without evidence, without a body, without anything beyond suspicious behavior and an unverifiable alibi, there was nothing they could do. The case that had gripped North Dakota for months slowly faded from public consciousness, joining the countless other unsolved disappearances that haunt the American landscape. Part 3. The Silence. 3 years passed, then 5, then 10. The Hartley family tried to rebuild their lives around the absence of their daughter. Susan Hartley continued working at the medical clinic, her smile a little less genuine, her eyes carrying a permanent sadness that those who knew her before could not help but notice. Robert Hartley retired from the grain elevator in 2008, spending his days maintaining the house, working in the garden during summer, staring out windows during winter. They never moved from Elm Street, never sold Michelle's belongings, never stopped hoping she might somehow walk back through the front door. For those who have ever lost someone without explanation, without closure, without the finality of a funeral or the certainty of death, the experience is a unique form of torture. Grief cannot complete its natural cycle. The mind cannot fully process the loss. Every knock on the door, every phone call, every stranger glimpsed in a crowd brings a moment of irrational hope followed by crushing disappointment. The Hartleys lived in this limbo, suspended between hope and despair, unable to move forward, unable to let go. The community of Garrison slowly returned to normal rhythms. The cottonwood trees leafed out each spring and shed their leaves each fall. Children grew up and moved away. Businesses opened and closed. Life continued with the relentless indifference it shows to individual tragedies. But those who had known Michelle never forgot her. Her photograph remained on the wall of the library. Her name appeared on prayer lists at First Lutheran Church. On February 10th each year, a small group gathered at the Hartley house to mark the anniversary of her disappearance, to remind the family they were not alone in remembering. David Keller remained in Garrison for 2 years after Michelle vanished. He continued working for the Olsons, continued living in his trailer, continued keeping to himself. Those who observed him closely noted that he seemed to relax as the investigation wound down, as if a weight had been lifted. He smiled more readily. He engaged in small talk at the hardware store. He appeared almost comfortable, as if he belonged. Then in the summer of 2007, David Keller left Garrison as quietly as he had arrived. He told the Olsons he had found work in Montana, better pay, better opportunities. He loaded his possessions into his white Ford truck one morning in July and drove away. The Olsons wished him well, grateful for his service. They hired a new farmhand, a local boy fresh out of high school. Life on the farm continued. Deputies whispered quietly among themselves that David Keller's departure felt significant, felt like a man running from something, but there was nothing they could do. He had broken no laws. He had every right to seek employment elsewhere. Agent Kohler added a note to Michelle's file, recording David's departure, maintaining the thread of suspicion that connected him to the case. In 2012, 7 years after Michelle's disappearance, Susan Hartley was diagnosed with breast cancer. She underwent surgery, radiation, chemotherapy. She fought with the same quiet determination she had shown in searching for her daughter. Robert cared for her through the treatment, and by 2013, the doctors declared her cancer-free. But the experience had aged them both. They spoke more openly about their mortality, about what would happen to Michelle's case when they were gone, about who would remember her, who would continue asking questions. The case file sat in a cabinet at the McLean County Sheriff's Department, occasionally reviewed when a new deputy joined the force, occasionally referenced when a similar case emerged elsewhere, but never advancing, never solving, never offering the answers the Hartley family desperately needed. Then in 2018, 13 years after Michelle vanished, something unexpected happened. A woman named Rebecca Thornton was reported missing in Hazen, North Dakota, a small town approximately 40 miles south of Garrison. Rebecca was 29 years old, worked as a bank teller, had last been seen leaving her apartment building one morning. Her car was found running in the parking lot, driver's door open, her purse still inside. The similarities to Michelle Hartley's disappearance were impossible to ignore. The investigation into Rebecca Thornton's disappearance moved quickly. Hazen police, aware of the Hartley case, immediately looked for connections. They interviewed Rebecca's friends, family, co-workers. They learned that Rebecca had mentioned feeling watched in the weeks before her disappearance. They discovered unexplained phone calls from an untraceable prepaid cell phone. They found witnesses who described seeing a white pickup truck in Rebecca's apartment complex parking lot on several occasions, though no one could identify the driver. Within 48 hours of Rebecca's disappearance, investigators had obtained security camera footage from a business across the street from her apartment. The footage showed a white Ford F-150 entering the parking lot at 6:42 on the morning Rebecca vanished. It showed a man approaching Rebecca's car as she started it. It showed a brief interaction that lasted less than 30 seconds. It showed Rebecca getting into the white truck voluntarily, as if she knew the driver. It showed the truck leaving the parking lot at 6:44. The license plate was partially obscured but readable. Investigators ran the plate. It came back registered to a David Keller, current address listed in Williston, North Dakota, approximately 100 miles northwest of Garrison. Everything suddenly connected. The similar circumstances, the white truck, the same name that had lingered in Michelle Hartley's case file for 13 years. Within hours, law enforcement descended on Williston, multiple agencies coordinating, everyone understanding that time was critical, that if Rebecca Thornton was still alive, every minute mattered. Part 4. The Revelation. They found David Keller at a construction site on the outskirts of Williston on the afternoon of March 22, 2018. He was operating heavy machinery, building a new commercial development, wearing work boots and a hard hat, seemingly unaware that his world was about to collapse. North Dakota Bureau of Criminal Investigation agents, supported by local police and sheriff's deputies, moved in with precision. They surrounded the site, blocked all exits, and approached David as he climbed down from the excavator cab. When Agent Sarah Dennison, who had worked Michelle Hartley's case 13 years earlier, identified herself and informed David Keller that he was under arrest for the kidnapping of Rebecca Thornton, witnesses reported that his face remained perfectly calm. He did not run. He did not resist. He simply asked if he could call his employer to explain he would not finish his shift. The request was denied. He was handcuffed, read his rights, placed in the back of an unmarked vehicle. As the car pulled away from the construction site, David Keller stared out the window at the landscape passing by, with an expression that those present described as almost resigned, as if he had been expecting this moment, perhaps even relieved that it had finally arrived. The interrogation began that evening at the Williston Police Department. David Keller sat across from Agent Dennison and Agent Kohler, the same investigators who had questioned him about Michelle Hartley in 2005. He waived his right to an attorney, a decision that puzzled the investigators but one they accepted. He sat calmly, his hands folded on the table, waiting. They asked him about Rebecca Thornton. He said he did not know anyone by that name. They showed him the security footage. He watched himself approach Rebecca's car, watched himself speak to her, watched her get into his truck. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "I would like to make a statement." What followed was a confession that lasted 4 hours and 23 minutes, recorded on video, witnessed by multiple law enforcement officers, detailed and methodical and absolutely chilling in its matter-of-fact delivery. David Keller confessed to abducting Rebecca Thornton on the morning of March 20th. He described how he had been watching her for weeks, learning her routine, understanding her habits. He admitted making the anonymous phone calls, trying to gauge her level of awareness, testing whether she would report the harassment. When she did not, he took it as a sign that he could proceed. On the morning in question, he had approached her in the parking lot, told her there had been an accident involving her sister, told her he worked with her brother-in-law, created an urgent story that compelled her to get into his truck. Once she was inside, he had driven directly to a storage unit he rented on the edge of Williston. "Where is Rebecca Thornton now?" Agent Dennison asked, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion. David Keller gave an address, a rural property he owned 30 miles outside Williston, a small cabin on 20 acres of isolated land. He said Rebecca was there, locked in the basement, alive but restrained. Law enforcement mobilized immediately. A tactical team raced to the address while the interrogation continued. They found the cabin exactly where David described it. They found Rebecca Thornton in the basement, bound and terrified but physically unharmed. She had been held for 46 hours. She was rescued and transported to a hospital for evaluation. She would survive. She would eventually recover, but she would never forget those 46 hours. With Rebecca safe, the interrogation shifted to Michelle Hartley. "Did you know Michelle Hartley?" Agent Kohler asked, though he already knew the answer. "Yes," David Keller said. "Did you abduct Michelle Hartley on February 10th, 2005? "Yes." The room fell silent. After 13 years, after countless hours of investigation, after endless sleepless nights for the Hartley family, the truth was finally being spoken. Those who have worked in law enforcement understand that confessions rarely bring the satisfaction one might expect. Instead, they bring a hollow kind of resolution, an acknowledgement of evil that offers answers but no comfort. David Keller described approaching Michelle Hartley that morning as she stood by her running truck. He said he had been watching her for months, learning her patterns, understanding when she would be most vulnerable. He told her there had been an accident at the school, that children had been injured, that as a substitute teacher she was needed immediately. Michelle, concerned for the children, had gotten into his truck without hesitation. He drove her to a remote location, a different property he had rented under a false name, far from Garrison, deep in the countryside where screams could not be heard. "Where is Michelle Hartley now?" Agent Dennison asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. David Keller provided coordinates. A location in western North Dakota, near the Montana border, on land that had belonged to an abandoned homestead. He said he had buried her there in February 2005, 2 days after taking her. He said he was sorry, though his tone suggested the apology was more ritual than genuine remorse. Law enforcement teams, working with anthropologists and forensic specialists, excavated the site David described. 3 days later, on March 25, 2018, they recovered human remains. Dental records confirmed the identity. Michelle Hartley had finally been found. The news reached Garrison like a thunderclap. The Hartley family, contacted by investigators and informed of the discovery, experienced emotions too complex to articulate. Relief that Michelle had been found, anguish at confirmation of her death, rage at the man who had taken her, grief renewed and raw despite 13 years of preparation. Robert Hartley told reporters that knowing was somehow both better and worse than not knowing, that at least Michelle could come home now, that at least they could lay her to rest properly, that at least they had answers, even if those answers broke their hearts all over again. The community of Garrison responded with shock and sorrow. Many had suspected Michelle was deceased, but suspicion and confirmation are entirely different things. The library where Michelle had volunteered held a memorial service. First Lutheran Church, where Michelle had attended Sunday services, filled beyond capacity for a funeral that had been delayed 13 years. Michelle was buried in the Garrison Cemetery on a spring day when the cottonwoods were just beginning to leaf out, the same trees that had stood witness to her vanishing so long ago. David Keller was charged with first-degree murder in Michelle Hartley's death, kidnapping and attempted murder in Rebecca Thornton's case, and multiple other charges across 2 counties. The trial began in January 2019. Prosecutors presented the security footage from Hazen, the confession, the forensic evidence, the pattern of behavior that connected both cases. Defense attorneys argued that the confession had been coerced, that David had mental health issues, that he deserved consideration for his cooperation. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. The sentencing hearing took place on March 4, 2019. Robert and Susan Hartley attended, sitting in the front row, holding hands, faces drawn but resolute. Rebecca Thornton provided a victim impact statement, describing the terror of her abduction, the nightmares that still plagued her, the way her life had been forever altered by those 46 hours. She looked directly at David Keller as she spoke, forcing him to see the human cost of his actions. The judge sentenced David Keller to 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus additional years for the related charges. In total, the sentence ensured David would never walk free again. As he was led from the courtroom, David Keller looked back once at the Hartley family. What expression crossed his face in that moment? No one could quite agree. Some said it was remorse. Others said it was simply emptiness, the absence of any real emotion at all. In the aftermath of the trial, investigators reviewed David Keller's history more thoroughly. They discovered he had lived in 6 different states over 20 years, always under the same name, always moving before anyone could learn too much about him. They found evidence suggesting he may have been involved in at least 3 other unsolved missing persons cases across the Midwest, though he refused to discuss anything beyond Michelle and Rebecca. Those cases remain open, families still waiting for the answers the Hartleys finally received. The media covered the trial extensively. The story of a cold case solved after 13 years captured national attention. True crime podcasts analyzed the investigation. Television documentaries examined the evidence. Michelle Hartley's photograph circulated once again, but this time accompanied by the resolution her family had sought for so long. This time with an ending, however tragic. Closing. The case of Michelle Hartley stands as a testament to the persistence of investigators who never gave up, to a family who never stopped hopping, and to a community that never stopped caring. It reminds us that evil often wears an ordinary face, that monsters live among us undetected, that vigilance and memory matter. Michelle was 27 years old when she vanished. She should have lived decades more. She should have taught countless children. She should have loved and been loved. She should have grown old. Instead, she became a name in a case file, a photograph on a memorial wall, a daughter whose parents spent 13 years waiting for news they hoped would never come. But Michelle Hartley is remembered, not just for how her life ended, but for how she lived, for her kindness, for her dedication to the children she taught, for the quiet grace she brought to every interaction. Justice, delayed though it was, finally arrived. The truth, buried for 13 years, finally emerged into light. If this story mattered to you, subscribe and hit the bell. Share the episode. Someone somewhere may still be waiting to be heard.